Just a quick reminder that each episode could contain some spoilers, so watch with discretion. Sit back and enjoy the show. Well, welcome to another episode of The Gamer's Advocate, where we discuss a variety of topics, and today we're going to be going over simulators. And the definition for simulators is pretty varied. Really, you can almost call any game a simulator, obviously. Even the virtual realities are kind of stepping into that definition of a simulator. However, very specifically, I think for context, that we want to probably refer to simulators as things that maybe we do day to day that kind of immerse us in that environment. I can think of like the truck simulators, the power wash simulators, the house renovator simulators, but even on a certain larger degree, the Sims simulator. I mean, the context is in their name, but of course, Microsoft, I think, was one of the first ones to kind of go out there on a limb and say, hey, look, we're going to go ultra realistic and go with the flight simulator. But you guys have any experience with simulator games?
I mean, as a kid, I used to enjoy trying to take off in Flight Simulator and didn't get particularly far in that. You have the variety of tycoon games. I don't know at what point we can call them simulators, but especially Transport Tycoon, Sim City, Sim Earth. I think it's Sim Copter. I can't remember if Sim Bus was real or if I've just made that up. doesn't sound real anymore as it crossed my lips. But simulators were a game that a genre game I used to really enjoy, especially when I was a kid, that I drifted away from as I got a bit older. And the only simulator game that I would play nowadays is probably Truck Simulator, both American and European.
I think I kind of had the opposite experience, where I was not particularly interested in sim games earlier on, and now with like House Flipper and Power Washer, like I really enjoy a game where I can just shut off, and I kind of think that's what a lot of like sim games do for me now is just give me something kind of mindless and a bit tedious, but they're typically designed in a way that takes the tedium out of a real experience and makes it just a little more pleasant. And I think that's kind of where I see the appeal now, because like I have a house, I don't want to renovate it, it's a lot of work, but I'll renovate a house in House Flipper for like 8 straight hours.
I think that's where you find often in simulation games the act of repetition, the boredom that you get within it. It can bring you into this almost meditative state where you're not enjoying the game, you're also not disliking the game. It just brings you into a very neutral, relaxed state of mind. And honestly, I would put it as almost akin to just doing nothing. If you think about now, if you do nothing, if you decide, I'm going to sit on the couch and do nothing, I'm going to sit on the balcony and do nothing, you're probably going to get your phone out and you're probably going to have a quick scroll, and then all of a sudden you're not doing nothing, you're scrolling, which is fine. It's a thing that you're doing, but you're not doing nothing. But I think the low level activity you get in some of these simple simulation games, not when you start cranking up the difficulties, when you start really making them genuine simulators, but when you get the nice soft version of Truck Simulator or House Flipper, whatever it might be, you're almost doing nothing. You're actually allowing your brain to turn off without actually turning it off. You're doing nothing without doing nothing.
I think that's exactly it. I think there's for people who have kind of felt that pressure to always be productive, there's a lot of times where you'll sit down and you don't have to be productive in that moment. You have time to yourself, and then you create this kind of pressure to maximize your enjoyment of that time. And so like I'll start playing a video game, and then I'll throw something on like YouTube or a video or something to watch, and just like overstimulate myself to the point where like I'm trying too hard to do too many things and I'm not really enjoying any of them. And then I'll play like a simulator game and it's the exact opposite, where it's like I'm genuinely trying to do nothing and it's working.
I think that's actually really it, hitting the point of the doing two things at once. I did it, I think, yesterday. At some point, I got all my work done over the course of the day, had nothing to do, gently easing into late on late in the evening, I'm going to play a little bit of Final Fantasy Rebirth. I'm going to practice. I'm going to try out some new materia combinations. And while I'm doing that, well, I haven't been keeping up with the news recently, so let's put a podcast on. Let's put a politics podcast on. And I realized after about an hour that I haven't really been playing the game, and I haven't really been paying attention to the podcast either. I've done neither of the two.
100% that.
Yeah. And then if I've maybe just, in this case, if I maybe just decided to play that simulator game for an hour and I've decided, no, I'm going to be in this simulator for an hour, it's something that you just settle into and you enjoy. And you really fully immerse yourself within that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a certain psychosis that goes with, some personalities that may say, look, I just don't have the willpower or the ability to go do much. So yeah, if you want to vegetate on, in front of the television or do nothing, whatever, that's fine. But the advantage of a simulator is that even though you're still not accomplishing anything, you feel like you've kind of accomplished something because you've advanced the progression of a game that would have not progressed on its own. You're actually engaged in it. And I think that's the big difference between gaming and other forms of media that would put you in that type of environment. It allows you to feel a certain level of accomplishment that is somewhat important for a certain, mentality. So,
well, yeah, I definitely think that's kind of a unique element of video gaming in general, where there's that natural interactivity you have from taking part in the video game, and so making progress in a game gives you a sense of accomplishment. And I think you've kind of nailed it with the sim games, in that, like, most sim games are not going to present a tremendous challenge. There's not going to be like a lot of mechanical skill you need to develop or game strategy you need to kind of figure out. It's mostly just about putting in a minimal amount of effort and making progress. And in some cases, I think that's like very therapeutic to just say, like, I'm just going to do what I need to do in this game and I'm going to get credit for it, and that's going to be enough.
Is there something you can read into that about your average everyday life? I mean, how many days will there be in life where you do everything you need to do, but no one says, attaboy? No one gives you that thumbs up. No one gives you that pat on the back. No one gives you the round of applause. And maybe, yeah, you search for that in that small amount of accomplishment that you can have in the video game. And I was thinking, especially with simulators as well, there is always that, and we're talking now about the more realistic simulators, as it were, whether it be truck simulator, flight simulator, whatever. You also have that ability to do something that isn't what you do. It's something entirely new, and you may not be able to do it in real life. So let's say you're going to play flight simulator. Well, I can't fly a plane, and I can't even think to myself that I would like to learn to fly a plane. So I've mentioned Legion before, and it's not really a thing to hide. It's very, very common. So I'm colorblind, the bland, boring colorblind that a lot of men are. And because of that, I cannot be a commercial airline pilot. You just cannot be one. So this game now allows me to try something that I couldn't do in real life and let you have a little glimpse of that. At the same time, American Truck Simulator, I'm not gonna do that. I guess that I probably could, but I'm not going to. But you allow me this little window into that world. So when you combine that with the ability to have this little small positive feedback loop all throughout your day, when you combine that with a chance to try something new, the attraction of simulators actually seems incredibly obvious.
Yeah, I think there might be, well, to stay on brand, I should say, we're probably going to all agree that it doesn't really matter the type of simulator. As long as it's done well, then we're going to enjoy it.
Yeah, our very bold stance that we always take.
But do y'all have a preference on, because modern gaming comes in different forms for simulators. There's the low poly, then there's the cartoony. I don't even know what to call it, because like House Renovator, Power Wash tend to do that simple asset, but they're not low poly for sure. And then you have real high resolution. Is there any one of those mediums that you would kind of gravitate to when you see a new simulator, or even just an old one that you prefer?
I like to feel like I'm really looking out the cockpit window if it's flight simulator. I want my realism. I want simulator to be the real encapsulation of that world of that word. Sorry, I want to imagine that this is actually real. So for me, the low poly things, the very stylized, more gamified simulators, and I don't mean that as a criticism, probably wouldn't appeal to me as immediately as something like, truck simulator, farming simulator, flight simulator, and the very real quality they try and provide.
Yeah, I think you nailed it with Flight Simulator. That game would be terrible in like low resolution, like weak textures. I don't need a game to look at a field of blue, which is what you're gonna get in a low resolution flight simulator. Like, I think the realism there is hugely appealing, particularly for games like Flight Simulator. That being said, the realism in House Flipper, like going from House Flipper 1 to House Flipper 2, I think they tried to make certain elements of the game a bit more realistic, and they lost me because I didn't want realism in that one. I wanted it to be oversimplified, and I wanted it to be just kind of like, I'm going to paint this room. That'll take 8 minutes. Whereas in real life, that would take me 2.5 days. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to move furniture out of the way. I don't want to put a tarp down to catch any paint splatters. Like, I just want it to be a different color. So I think what you're trying to accomplish in the simulator is hugely helpful in determining what type of simulator you want to make, whether or not it's realistic or a bit cartoony in the way that House Flipper is. And I think you kind of hit an interesting one with Power Wash Simulator, because the character that you play as and like the tools at your disposal in Power Wash Simulator are very simple. They're very like, it's tough to apply the term like low poly, but they are not going for realism with those assets. The assets that they've really sunk a lot of time and effort into are what you're cleaning. So like when you look at the Final Fantasy VII expansion and you're cleaning the Scorpion tank or the Buster, they're very, very detailed. They're very highly precise models of these game assets. And that's the appeal, is like you get to just kind of look over this really cool video game asset from another series and like just enjoy kind of messing around with it. It's a bit akin to playing with like Legos, and you build your own little model of something, and that's I feel like that's the feeling that you kind of get in Power Wash Simulator, where you're cleaning off something which itself seems a bit tedious and not something I would want to do with my time. But weirdly enough, it works because I'm cleaning off something that I think is really cool looking.
So my hunch has prevailed. I think Hum is saying that he tends to gravitate toward the more realistic side. You tend to be on the more medium side, not high, not low. I'm on the low side. I prefer the low quality, low poly version of Sims. So
I do like the idea that I just can't choose a side. It's just going to be a running pattern here.
Very comfortable on that fence.
Yeah.
I think there's something else which is worth noting. Well, two things actually. One of them is this is a podcast based on simulators, and we still found a way to talk about Final Fantasy VII. It is still in there, and we will not forget that. And the other thing was about the idea of normality. Of stylized art, whether it be realistic art. There's a common theme which I think it comes up in the few examples we've given, and that's really all I've got to work with for the moment. But I almost feel as though the tasks that are being simulated that are the more banal, the more likely you are to do it in your real life, Power Wash, House Flipper, they're a bit stylized. They're a bit cartoony. Because that's a bit too real. If you're making me play Dishwasher Simulator, for example, and all of a sudden they look like real dishes, and all of a sudden I've got to worry about the mildew, I'm not going to play it. I want a stylized, light version of this I can just get in and enjoy for the meditative aspect. But if it's something you're less likely to be doing in your daily life, or it's about a profession that you're probably not a part of, so whether it be now flight simulator, farming simulator, bus simulator, city planner simulator, I feel they can lean more into the realism. because they're not going to inspire that instinct in you of, I don't want to do the dishes. I don't want to drive the bus today. The novelty almost permits them to be more realistic.
Yeah, I think games like The Sims, though, have to portray a certain type of art because the direction they go with that, especially with their stories, because it's one thing for them to have like a campus life DLC or something, but it's another thing entirely when they start bringing people back from the dead in their ghost form. I mean, how real do you want that to look? There's certain...
Very.
Yeah.
That's where I want the realism in the
Yeah.
Sims.
Have we not been clear?
Yeah.
That's what we're all leaning towards.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, but I do think the Sims have definitely found their art style. It took them a little while because, I come from SimCity 2000 and, things like that. So for me, the low poly has always been a better format for me because in real life, I'm not a micromanager, but in gaming I am. And so unfortunately, the higher resolution and the more modern games, they give you the micromanagement ability, but it's at a totally other level. You have like the more modern Rome games don't work as well as the old Caesars game, because the Caesar game was a little bit more like, yes, it got a little bit more complicated, but it was also more interesting because of how you could use those assets and how you could integrate certain cultures and factions and make them all work, and the gods you had to appease. And so there's a lot going on there, but you still had the ability to customize your city how you wanted to meet that expectation. Whereas nowadays that exists, but they either have to say, okay, so we're going to make the games look really great. We're going to make them look, graphically stunning. You can see the waves hitting the shore and a bunch of other things. But when they look at that and they don't actually balance out the economics, or they don't balance out the factions, then they start supplementing that with like trees that don't allow you to, actually they make it more complicated, but just unnecessarily complicated. So I think going with it's kind of weird, the graphics that were low poly or more pixelated, I think the mindset was like, we don't need to make this overly complicated to still make it fun. So gameplay came first in that regard. So you wouldn't think that the simulated graphics would follow the gameplay, but they apparently have, because I definitely gravitate toward the older simulator games because they just seem more balanced and more engaging than the modern ones do.
Well, I think you kind of touched on another element of simulator games that is worth mentioning, and that is complexity where it's necessary. So in games like SimCity and City Skylines more recently, like you'll see a lot of different overlays that you can bring up to show you what the state of your city is and what's on people's minds. And I think like with City Skylines, you'll link that to the real world and the way that cities are managed, and it seems like there's never any way to make everybody happy. But in City Skylines, it's simplified, so like you don't feel like it's a career in politics and you're just trying to appease everybody, as much as like you can really kind of address their concerns and get a reasonable reaction from them. And I think if they were to try and match that up to the real world, where no matter what you do, people are still going to be upset with you, I don't want that simulated. I don't need that in my game. I have that in real life. So like that element of the complexity of a game doesn't need to be there, because that's what I'm escaping at the moment. And I think if they were to take games like the SimCity or City Skylines and add just that additional complexity to say like, oh yeah, Mike wants a school in his neighborhood so his kids can go to school, and you build a school and Mike's still not happy because Mike is just that guy who will never be happy.
Yeah.
I don't need that included in the game. I feel like there's a way for me to enjoy this without it getting to that point.
And that's where you start to ask, at what point do you actually really want a simulator? And at what point do you want a gamified version of the simulator that you're
Yeah.
actually talking about? And I think this is where simulators can actually do themselves a big favor. So we could have the real microscopic detail. We could have the world that you just spoke of. So I'm thinking of places like, so where I live now, there's parts of Paris where we're pedestrianizing individual streets, and you'll tend to see a really positive response to that because you have the terraces now can open up and the bars can move out into the streets. People can walk in the street without worrying about traffic. It's safe for cyclists with no car traffic coming through. But then there's always someone who posts in response to the Instagram, yeah, but what if I need my car? Always. No matter what you do, despite this thing that we all seem to love there will be a negative response. So we could simulate that, or we could just have in your game that the greenifying the area is objectively better, or adding in a new school is objectively better, or building this extra prison is objectively better. And what I was going to try and get to before I lost my train of thought halfway through was the idea that you can have simulators which are realistic, you can have them which are a bit more gamified. And a really good simulator in my mind, and I remember Silent Hunter 3 did this, so this is one of the U-boat simulators in World War II. Give me some damn sliders so I can decide to what point my simulator is a simulation and to what point it's gameplay. If you let me have that little bit of control, we can all be happy.
And I think that's unique within simulators. They could do that, but a lot of times I think I hate speculating on most gamers. I hate saying that, but I think a lot of gamers would say that if there's a campaign, any way to integrate a story to it, and that's where I think Power Wash comes in, and certain games like that are pretty unique because they're integrating a story without you even realizing it. It's kind of like the lore discussion we had. It's there if you want it, but they're not really focused on that. But yeah, as far as a slider is concerned, with the amount of integration you have, that would be unique among simulators. They could do that actually, but I think developers probably recognize that a lot of people will focus more on a campaign or just performing tasks, and that's why there's a sandbox mode in a lot of them. And the sandbox mode just gives you just free reign to, unlimited money, unlimited time. You can do a disaster if you want to, if it's integrated in that respect. I play a lot of Planet Coaster and a lot of Planet Zoo. Planet Coaster 2 is just announced a couple days ago, so you may not see much of me once that comes out. They were the ones, Frontier is the ones who came up with Roller Coaster 3, I believe. And that had a water park integrated in it. And a lot of people have always wondered, hey, look, when are you going to do a water park? We would really like to see that in Planet Coaster. And Frontier has their own workshop, so people would upload things into that. They would create detailed assets and make them playable within game. They weren't native to the game, so sometimes they would break your game. But they were always asked, like, you need to integrate some water park features. Well, Planet Coaster 2 is going to have that native to it. In fact, that's their big thing. That's what they've been advertising. The very first scenes in their trailer was a person going down a slide at the same time as a roller coaster was going to go down. So it was very specific about what they're trying to achieve, and they listen to their crowd, their consumers, I should say, because Planet Zoo doesn't have any rides whatsoever, but it's they really focus on a realistic side of the animals, but the assets and the individuals, I think they call them widgets in Planet Coaster, they really focus on them being more of the stylized look, which is, they look great. The music in that game is phenomenal too, but there's a lot of things in that simulated game that are just so addictive because you can choose to do a campaign, you can do a sandbox mode. The assets allow you to kind of freely build however you want to. You can also give yourself limitations. You can say, I don't want building collisions at all. So that way you try to build something, it'll say, no, you can't do that because it'll collide with the ground, or it'll collide with water, it'll collide with another building or something like that. So it has all those in game, and it's highly customizable. So I'm really looking forward to that coming out this year, actually. But I think with what you were saying with the City Skylines, I always like winter maps. And I always found City Skylines to be so difficult in the winter because you have all the regular issues of a city with also trying to heat them. And you start off with a regular budget just like everybody else, like any other map. But now you have to create heat pipes too. So you're really short on money really quick. And that's where I was saying is like, I didn't have these issues with SimCity 2000 and SimCity 3000. It was just, it got cold, great, wonderful, but everybody still got their water. Everybody still had their electricity. So I like the micromanagement side of it, but I was like, man, I don't want to micromanage that much just to make a city. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm like, you gave a really good example, because I can definitely tell where my point of enjoyment for some of those city simulators ends right about SimCity 3000, maybe 4. One of my favorite low poly games for sim games was Sim Golf, which is not available on Steam. I still have my discs and everything for it, but it was one of those, you know, because modern golf games, of course, modern sim golf games are hyper realistic. There, you can see the green, you can see the, you know, there's going to give you wind direction, which that game did too. But it's the physics on it are very complex, and that's what people want. And you know, you have I think it's Tiger Woods Golf or something. They're like I said, they're hyper realistic, and that's what people want. Kind of like Microsoft Flight Simulator, same thing. But for me, that Sid Meier's Sim Golf was hours and hours and hours of fun, as low poly as it was. It was really enjoying, because you had to, once you got a certain map done, you got more money and stuff. So there was a progression system to it. But even really in its sandbox mode, it was just thoroughly enjoyable. But anyway, that was my kind of 2 cents on the low poly side.
Well, I think you've also hit on a kind of unique element of sim games that you might not see in other genres, and that is the kind of customizing the level of challenge you want in your game. Like you can see it in other games in a very simplified version of just setting a difficulty, or maybe like Baldur's Gate 3 hardcore mode or honor mode, where you get a single save and you just have to deal with the consequences of your actions without save scumming being an option. I think sim games immediately recognized that they needed to include that to maintain a wider appeal. So you'll have games that have that sandbox mode, like creative mode in Minecraft, where people can build whatever they want. They don't have to worry about gathering resources or fabricating anything, or just the process of getting to the end result. But then you'll have players who do challenge mode in games like that, where everything has to go through this long process, and they'll adjust settings to make it more challenging. They'll do like a survival mode where, you know, you have to sleep regularly and eat to just kind of maintain your survival. And I think sim games right away recognized that their gameplay lends itself to that customization, so that every player can get the experience they want out of their sim game. So like, if I want to play Frostpunk on the lowest difficulty and have my little power fantasy where I save everybody, I can do that. Meanwhile, somebody could play that game and there might be one person left by the time that they've finished the objectives, and they can take pride in playing on that, you know, heightened difficulty and getting through it. I like my little frozen utopia idea a little bit more.
That's something that I always enjoyed about games that gave you the sort of management side. So this could be city management, it could be managing a company, it could be sports management. I mean, some of the biggest simulation games in the world probably wouldn't speak so much to Americans, but the Football Manager series, so this would be soccer from your perspective, that is enormous, and the detail that they go down into, and the way that the systems all interact with each other, the match day simulator, the transfer market simulator, the clubs, the owners' motivations, the managers' motivations, contract negotiations. These are immense games in terms of the scale of their simulation. But what I quite like about these games, so whether it be Football Manager, whether it be Cities Skylines, Crusader Kings, that's a hell of a simulation. I mean, it really is nothing other than a simulation. It's a medieval life simulator. is I like that the difficulty as well that you choose to play with doesn't necessarily reflect on you choosing a difficulty for yourself. So what I might say is, if you think of, let's go with Football Manager. It's an easy one. It's the one I know quite well. Why, if I was the manager of this football team, why would I be controlling everything anyway? Don't I have an assistant coach who should be doing the daily training? Don't I have a scout who should be going and watching those matches played by the young Cypriot teams to look for that 16-year-old wunderkind who's going to be the next star of our team? So I like the idea that sometimes you can control the difficulty in these simulation games, not by lowering the difficulty per se, but almost by imagining that you're just delegating the tasks to other people. And it's actually just a reflection on your management style. And then, as Bananas pointed out, you could choose to go the other way. You could choose to be the most micromanaging, finicky, horrible boss. The boss of your nightmares is always looking over your shoulder and checking that the sewers are running correctly. You could be that. Or you could be someone who sat back just looking at the overview of the project.
I'm just trying to imagine an analog in other genres where you have that customization of just how challenging you want it, and it doesn't really hold up. Like, you try to imagine the way things work in like a Mass Effect game. It's just a flat difficulty, and it's typically combat exclusive that difficulty even plays an impact. There's not a difficulty for earning approval within your team in Mass Effect. You do what's right for your team, and they appreciate it.
I was just thinking of a tiny exception to that came to my mind. So a difficulty for earning approval. I'm thinking of playing, I think it was Fallout 1. If you play that with no points in intelligence, you lose an immense amount of possibilities to talk with people. You speak, I think, in fragmented sentences the entire time to show that your sort of Neanderthal brain just isn't able to put this together. So there is a way of doing it, but look how far I had to go back to think of an example. Fallout 1.
Yeah. Yeah, Baldur's Gate, the original series, did something like that, and you had to have an intelligence at least of 4, but they kind of took that information from D&D rule set, so it was the same concept.
Yeah, I forget exactly what it is with D&D. I think like if you have an intelligence of 3 or lower, you just cannot speak any language. So I think they just adopted that to Baldur's Gate. But I think that exists within Baldur's Gate in a much more kind of complex way with the charisma system as well, in that certain conversation options are only available to you if your charisma score is high enough. And I think that's probably a more interesting way of doing it than just like a harsh cutoff to say that, oh yeah, if your intelligence is this low, you're done. There's no communication for you. You're just going to struggle all the way. Whereas you could say like, if your charisma is like an 8, people are probably going to be a little more suspicious of you. They'll probably want, a little more proof for any claims you make or something along those lines. And I think that kind of sliding scale makes for a better engagement.
There's a slight awkwardness I've always found with the sliding scale, though, when I think of just the reality of people that you meet. Have you ever met someone who is so charismatic that they're just slimy? And you just don't trust them? I think something's off. And it's a limitation of video games, of course. I mean, that is going to be an incredibly hard thing to, keyword of the day, simulate. But we did it. We brought it back. Yeah. But yeah, it's just one of those little details that I've always thought is quite uncanny with video games, is when you do have that sliding scale, that you almost lose that little bit of room for nuance that's actually there.
Yeah, charisma for especially the old rule sets for D&D. I like playing a rogue, so all my points are in dexterity and charisma all the time, every time, because I can get myself anywhere, I can get myself out anywhere, and the dexterity allows, it gives those bonuses to those abilities to be a rogue. So yeah, I love high charisma.
But I'm imagining that character as being incredibly sleazy. Incredibly. I wouldn't want to know that person. Someone with very smart fingers and almost too sharp tongue.
So I think like there are other sports games out there that also kind of lend itself to a really unique position of moving that needle of simulation of a person. I can think right now of The Show, which is PlayStation only, I believe, which is a shame because it really needs to be on PC. But you are if you want to play it from the very beginning, you can start, I believe, in like single A, maybe double A baseball. And through your experience of learning how to pitch, you actually get stronger through the repetition. You develop certain pitches. You can apply those experience points as a pitcher, for instance, into your rotation. And so you're forcing the game to recognize your ability. And then you get maybe even traded. You can accept a trade or whatever the terms of whatever you want to say for it. So it actually is a really interesting simulator, not just a sports game. So although you're not the manager or the owner of the but I think there might be a mode for that. I don't know. I like I said, it's on PlayStation, which I don't have one. So if you play as that player, then you can make it to the majors, and then once you have certain experience points, you kind of use that to unlock other little features of the game. So it really is kind of an interesting little simulator in a sports game that otherwise would just be like, okay, you're out there, you play baseball for your team or whatever, and then that's it. But it's a little bit more than that.
Well, I'm worried that we might have missed something actually with this podcast. Is we could probably talk a lot more about sports games and simulations, because the more I think about it, FIFA can be done in a very similar way. Football Manager, and that's sort of two sides of the same coin, whereby you have one game that's a very light simulation. In FIFA, you're playing your game with normally the sport has 45 minutes per half. In FIFA, you're tending to play 5 or 6. So the pace is drastically increased. You spend a lot less time dithering around with the ball in midfield. Your players aren't really dropping down, leaning forward, trying to catch their breath because they've just done a long bursting run to the other side of the field. So we simulate the game of football, but in a very streamlined manner. But then you've got Football Manager, which is really simulating a genuine 90-minute game. It's only showing you the highlights, but it's simulating a 90-minute game down to the details, and you're managing injuries, you're managing fatigue, you're managing formation, and the players are not doing what you're controlling and telling them to do. They're doing what you told them to do before the game. And you're now subject to their whims. If a player is a bit more cavalier, he might ignore your instructions. If a player is quite sensitive and you stand on the sideline and you yell at him, he suddenly might put his head down and get a bit quiet. On the other hand, someone who's a bit more gregarious and responds well to that, you might pump them up by doing that. And then I was thinking as well of the UFC video games. They allow you to play this career mode where you essentially simulate the life of a fighter. And it sounds very, very similar to what the show has done, because you level up, so to speak, your character in the same way that you used to in the Elder Scrolls, and that you do in real life, by repeating the damn action. If you want your character to have a better left-hand jab, you better start jabbing. And you better start knocking people down with that jab, because that's how the game is going to give you those points. If you want the right hook, you'd better do that. At the same time, the game allows you to negotiate. It's a quick game. It doesn't simulate too much. But your contract, choosing your fights, what you do in your pre-fight camp, because that's a real thing, so of course you're going to have to do that. How you react on social media. There's a surprising amount of depth of the simulation in even the simplest of sports games. And they are probably left out a bit too easily of the discussion of simulation games as a whole.
Yeah, I think sports games definitely fall into kind of a unique subcategory of simulation. And then I think even to make that statement, you might have people who are huge sports games fans. Words are hard. And if we were to describe their favorite games as simulation games, they might not take too kindly to that description. Say like, no, they're sports games. They're their own thing. But I think you've really highlighted why they are a subcategory of simulation games, and it's entirely up to the developers as to how complex they want that simulation to be. Sports games, for the most part, would be physics engine simulations, and then how people kind of fit into that physics engine and the limitations of the rules of the game that they're playing. But if you want to get into the simulation of team interactions, trades, contract negotiations, public appeal to say, how are fans supporting a team? Is it likely that this team's going to pick up and move to a new city? Like, there's a huge array of options to go with when you look at a sports simulation as opposed to just kind of a general simulation game. And I think it's kind of another one of those points where we're not going to take a stand on. It's up to you to prioritize what level of complexity suits you, and the same for developers as to what aspect of this is most important for you to simulate, and what are you trying to capture in your game.
The sports games, like I said, what I think helps quite a bit is that your ability to learn the game and play it better forces the game to recognize that. You're not just on a team, a really horrible player playing on expert difficulty, just getting by. That doesn't happen. The game won't let you do that, right? You're going to lose every game, right? So as you kind of progress, and that I brought up the show with baseball, because in baseball, the minor leagues is a very, very important thing, just as much as the majors are. You just don't see all that going on. But the minors are a place that that players can be sent to either get better or rehab and all that other stuff, or where players are emerging from. And so unlike other games where like you really just have a professional league and they might own some minor leagues, that's not really where they're recruiting and developing their players from. Basically, they're doing it through free agency and whatnot. But in baseball, it's a real developmental thing. They call it the farm, right? So there's a reason for it. They grow prospects. And so you use that basis for forcing the game, like I said, to recognize your development as a player. And so I think that's pretty unique. And so when you talk about like customizing a person, I think that sports games might be the closest in doing that than any other medium, a format of games.
It's a very strange thought, isn't it? Especially because
Yeah.
I think, and this is mostly based upon cliches, stereotypes, that's a French word, short interactions on Twitch, with some people in real life as well, my brother. The audience for simulation games and sports games is often not thought of as being exactly the same. I mean, how many times have you read that very tedious joke on Twitch? I'm looking at you. How many times have you seen that joke of someone's talking about sports and then someone jumps in and goes, hey, go sports ball. Oh, shut up. But there's an odd idea where the biggest nerds in the world are quite possibly sports fans. The biggest nerdy thing about me, if I really look at what I know about and what I care about stats in, is sports. 100%. Doesn't even compare with video games. I think that's in a weird way why sports, I was just saying sports now, but let's say football. It's the easiest one for me to go with. You can make an in-depth simulation for football that's going to appeal to a lot of people because a lot of us know this stuff already. We already have our knowledge of the players. Even if you have a casual fan in the United Kingdom of the Premier League, they're probably going to know the 20 teams in the Premier League. They'll probably know roughly the 24 teams in the league below the Championship. They'll probably know the first team players, or most of them, let's say over half of every single team for their favorite team and their rival. They'll know probably all the players. The people on the substitutes bench and in the reserve teams, they'll probably know some of those too. So they've got this massive array of knowledge that's almost waiting to be used in the game that suits those. So a sports game for a sport that you like can immediately throw you in at the deep end and just say, look, here's this gigantic field of numbers. Here's this essential Excel spreadsheet of a video game. Have fun. And that's oddly enough, I think, where something like SimCity, City Skylines, Flight Simulator might struggle is most of us are not pilots. We're not city planners. And you've got to sort of hold our hand through that initial development progress. And you're going to do that in SimCity by giving us a tiny city to work with. You can do that in Flight Simulator by giving us what was it in the old games? Just a Cessna, as opposed to a Boeing 747. Sports games, they can just throw you in. Because you probably know what you're doing already. if you're the kind of person who's going to play that game.
I think, yeah, there's two major points I want to hit. One of them you nailed with that kind of already having some understanding of sports games before even starting to play. So you guys are aware I used to work for Boeing, so I've done support for their vertical lift division. So they but yeah, having worked on this aircraft device, there are times where we'll do simulations in the lab to make sure everything's working the way it's supposed to. And our more complicated lab had actual flight simulation information in. There's flight sim data, there's maps and everything. And I remember just testing out basic functionality that I had worked on required a very simple flight test in this simulation. And just getting a helicopter to maintain altitude with manual controls, not like defaulting over to an autopilot, it's way more precise than you would think. There's a lot of like minor adjustment you have to constantly keep doing in what is meant to be a real or a realistic simulation. It's supposed to be as close as you can get to actually flying this aircraft. And you don't want that in a flight sim game. Like I don't want to struggle to do the most simple thing in an aircraft in flight sim. Like just hovering in a helicopter is a colossal pain in real life. I don't want it to be like I need to completely focus on this incredibly simple element of flight. And I think that's something you don't have to worry about with sports games, is you could throw somebody in, and at its core, the sport was appealing because everybody had the basic understanding, the basic ability to do what is necessary for that sport. You don't have to be extremely polished to get it right away. And I think that's where sports games kind of exist in a unique subset where they can just be like, yeah, you know, it's soccer, just go play.
And that, if I can briefly interject on that, that's true. Think of the way that video games speak a language that's unspoken. So we generally, as a rule, as video gamers, if we're playing with a controller, we don't need to be told that the right stick turns the camera and the right trigger or R2 shoots the gun, the L2 probably looks down the barrel. You don't need to tell us in an RPG when that massive, suspiciously open circular room ahead of you is coming up, you might want to save. Or if a game is suddenly throwing ammunition at you, there's probably something coming, and it's speaking in a language you know. Essentially all a sports simulation game is doing, is it's doing that to you, but with a language that you learned outside of video games, and you already understand what's going on. Sorry to interject.
I don't know. Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right that sports kind of have that unique, like, you don't need a tutorial for sports games because it's a sport. Everybody already knows the rules, or they can go find them very easily. And I think another element that is very unique to sports games or sports simulations is simulating mistakes. And this is something that used to drive me nuts because I used to play like NFL games, Madden and 2K Sports before they kind of disappeared. When you have those sports games with that simulation and they simulate a bad call, it's like, I don't need that in the game. That's something we want to avoid in real life. You don't need to integrate it into this simulation. I don't want an umpire's inability to process reality at, superhuman speeds to get in the way of the simulated sports games. It already does that enough in real sports games.
Well, that's odd enough, talking about like the range of simulation, and I could be wrong depending on the last generations, but when I was playing these games, which would have been sort of 2006, 2010, that period, if I remember correctly, in FIFA or Pro Evolution Soccer, which were the main, just pick up and play with your friends, one player plays a team one, player plays as team two, that kind of sports game, if I remember correctly, you never had an incorrect call. If a player was offside by this much, then the player would be caught every time. If a player was onside by this much, that player would be not caught every time. On the other hand, Football Manager, which is supposed to be about the trials and tribulations of managing this football team, you will get bad decisions. And I still remember not qualifying for the Champions League final with my Napoli team on Football Manager 2007 after Pavel Pogrebniak's header was ruled out incorrectly for offside. I remember that, and that frustration that came from it, which is what I was looking for in that simulation game. But in a simple head-to-head sort of straight-up soccer/football game, yeah, it's not what I'm looking for, because like you say, that frustration exists already in real life. I'm looking for a light simulation, not a heavy one.
American football, I believe, is in a unique position because I know a ton of people who know football really well, but they don't play any of the EA games for Madden or any of those games because it's not qualifying their knowledge of the game. And I can appreciate that because when I played football, I had a coach tell me, he's like, really, you don't design plays to obviously be specifically 10 yards or 20 yards or, you don't expect that. But each play is kind of designed, offensive play, I should say, to score. That's why you have the arrows that go, infinitely up, each one. But something broke down. Something happened that inevitably led to you not being able to score on that play. So you can have the most genius mind for football and apply it towards something like Madden. But what Madden does that's pretty unique is it incorporates a lot of those real world things. So you can be a really good player at Madden, but each player has their own stats. Your line may be horrible. Your wide receivers, your performance players that are like running backs and things like that may be great. But if your line is horrible, then the defense is going to be able to get in there and disrupt the play. So that's where that chaos happens, and that's where the simulation begins. And so it's interesting that, at least with American football, a lot of the people that I know that love Madden aren't always the most knowledgeable when it comes to football. They just know how to play that game. So it's kind of really in a weird juxtaposition between those two things that you're talking about. Yes, you don't have to learn football or the game to play the game, but things like Madden are really unique because I don't know a ton of people who know a lot about football that also love that. There's a few.
I think that ties back to a point I tried to make earlier in that, like, it comes down to prioritizing what it is you want your simulation game to be. And in sports games like Madden and FIFA, where they're simulating the actual contest on the field, there's that element of mechanical skill to play the game. But for Football Manager, it's more strategic. It's not about the mechanical skill. It's about your knowledge of the sport and your knowledge of the way the league is set up and taking advantage of opportunities when they present themselves. It's a much more tactical game. And it's very interesting that within one genre of simulation games or just sports games, you can have two games tackle the same topic to say, like, this is Football Manager or this is FIFA. This is a football game. And they're completely different. One of them is very much like, learn to play the game, get good with these controls, get used to navigating the field with your players and taking advantage of your right wing's high stats, and he'll bolt down the field. You'll send him an open pass as he breaks past the final defender, and you'll get a goal. Or in Football Manager to say, we're going to trade that guy because he's very valuable right now, might not be as valuable next season. Let's make the strategic call to say, we're going to replace him and try to get more value out of this. It's a completely different goal with the same exact content to say, this is just football. You've been following it your entire life. You watch these games already, but they're two completely different representations of the same thing. And I don't think you see that as much outside the genre of simulation.
But that's why I can appreciate gamers who play these games, because whereas you can just watch a game, you're still getting nothing done. You can enjoy it, and obviously it's entertainment. We love it. We love our sports. But when you're actually playing the game and creating a value for yourself and your accomplishment, I think I can really appreciate gamers who enjoy that type of format.
It's an interesting idea. I would love to see, just out of interest and nothing more than that, how much players of the more strategic sports management games, so again, the most ubiquitous one is Football Manager, how much they would enjoy games like SimCity, how much they would enjoy City Skylines, because their game has a lot more in common with that than it does with anything else. It's almost as different as, if you're thinking of the World Wars, it's as different as playing Battlefield 1942 and playing Hearts of Iron. That's what FIFA and Football Manager are. They're an entirely different take on this. So I'd love to know if there is a crossover between players of sports simulation games and what we would think of as the strategic simulation games. But I would imagine almost certainly no one knows.
I don't know what the direct relationship would be. Maybe it's just the people I know, but a lot of the people I know that really do enjoy those football, or not football, but sports games like that, also like the Total War series. And it really, and I can see the relationship. I can totally see it's not a one-to-one, because there's obviously a lot more micro issues going on in a sports game. But in those Total War series, you have the type of enemy, the type of defenses, the type of units that you have, the health of the units, and you can recreate battles. And it's very close, so I can kind of see where the minds are going there and seeing the relativity between them. But
yes, the appreciation for tactics, the appreciation for strategy.
I think that's probably something we can invite the audience to weigh in on, is if you are a fan of the more kind of arcade style sports games, things like Madden or FIFA, what else is on your games library? What other games do you like to play? Things I would expect, things like Call of Duty, or those kind of highly mechanical skilled games that are about quick reflexes and mastering the controls. And if you're more in the or if you see more of the appeal from Football Manager, I would expect more tactical games, maybe real-time strategy, things along those lines. But yeah, I'd be very curious to see what kind of feedback we can get to say, yeah, I like Football Manager and StarCraft, and I think those two weirdly line up in a way you might not have guessed.
Very good point.
I certainly didn't consider the crossover between them before we started talking about it. It's really only in the last 20-30 minutes that's seemed so apparent, so readily obvious that must be the case. So yeah, I'd love to see the data.
Well, I appreciate everybody being here today, and we'll cover our next topic here for you soon. And remember, videos are going to come out every Monday and Friday, and if you enjoy the conversations that we're having, then like the video, but give a subscribe. But always remember that subscribing only gets you on the list. You have to hit the alert button to get notifications. So we'll see you guys again soon. Thank you very much. Yeah, the European Championships. And so somebody was saying, how does a country even qualify for that? And then I saw like answers were like, well, I think you got to be a country first of all. And my answer was like, I think you have to actually refer to it as football instead of soccer to even be considered.
Well, you say that, you currently have at the same time, just for all of our friends from across the pond, you have the Copa America taking place. Not the Copa America, sorry. Is it, what do you call it? The Cup of the Americas?
I don't know.
Either way, there's a tournament
I've been
going
referring
on
to it as
now.
Copa America. So
Okay, it may be that. I thought I was confusing it with the equivalent of the Champions League. But you have that going on at the same place as well. And when you said you have to be a country to qualify for the European Championships, kind of, but not exactly.
Yeah.
Because if we're being really fussy about it, and I'm not, because this isn't what I think, England qualified. That's not a sovereign country. The United Kingdom is the sovereign country. And speaking as someone from Wales, we didn't fucking qualify. You can always have these little bits of variation.
Right.
That bit's getting cut. That was not relevant. 44 minutes.
We're gonna start. We're gonna start with that. It'll be the intro.